itself as the greatest democracy in the world cannot allow a plutocratic, oligarchic, commercial mass media to run it into the ground. And it's not enough to say we can have our own independent media. It's not enough to say we can have our own blogs. It's like saying we will abandon the green fields of fertile crops for the nearby arid areas and try to sprinkle a few drops of water to produce a few plants. The mass commercial media is occupying our property. It is occupying our public trust that the First Amendment deposited in the media. The only business that's recognized and protected by the First Amendment. That's a lot of public trust to squander. A mass commercial media that is worse than it was 30 years ago, less cognizant of its obligations in terms of the public trust for the written media, in terms of the public interest, convenience, and necessity standards for the public airways broadcasters under the 1934 Communications Act. We're not just seeing what we saw in 1960s and 70s. By comparison, they were the golden age, however limited, of reflecting what was going on the ground in America, by comparison. Let me indicate the penalties that we are forced to pay. The 9 months before the Bush-Cheney drumbeats for their criminal, unconstitutional, brutal invasion of Iraq and its subsequent sociocide, over 300 retired top military, diplomatic, and national security officials spoke out against the pending war. They spoke out specifically, precisely, from their experience under both administrations before they retired. They were generals, admirals, high officials of the National Security Agency, of the CIA, of the Diplomatic Corps. There were people who were close advisors like Jim Baker and Brent Scowcroft to George Herbert Walker Bush, the first Bush president. There were people like the head of the National Security Agency and four-star General Howard Odom, the former head of the Pacific Fleet, Vice Admiral Shanahan, military Marine General Anthony Zinni, a specialist in the Middle East. There was another voice against the Iraq War, multi-billionaire George Soros. Repeated, vociferous, challenging. Somehow the connection between his ability and capacity to provide an infrastructure for these 300 or so patriots to multiply themselves, to get them on the mass media to challenge the recurrent lies of Bush and Cheney about the reasons for entering Iraq, the lies about the weapons of mass destruction, the lies about the connection with Al-Qaeda, the lies about the threat to the U.S. through Iraqi drones, would have multiplied them within weeks to 1,000 all over the country. Had that been done, these retired officials would have been on Capitol Hill. There would have been congressional hearings. The complicit media would not have been so complicit. It's hard to challenge the experience and patriotism of these retired officials. The process would have been exposed for what it was, a mass platform of lies, cover-ups, and deceptions by Bush and Cheney, and a compliant media and a passive Democratic Party on Capitol Hill, with few exceptions. the war in Iraq would have been averted. And then what else would have been averted? The metastasis into one country after another, into Syria, into North Africa, into Libya, into Yemen, into East Asia, to Southeast Asia. A lot of that would never have happened. That's what today is all about. It's to propose the establishment of a secretariat sufficiently funded so whenever the drumbeats for criminal aggression rise up in Washington, fostered by the military-industrial complex desire for more profit, promoted by a Wall Street that doesn't know who it is anymore, so monetized is its conscience, could never get this country embroiled in a quagmire again. Anybody listening or watching to this day who has means and wants to change the course of our country from the criminal wars that are blowing back and will inevitably embroil our own country in violence and attacks. Anyone of means who wants to fund this nonprofit secretariat, who is watching this, please come forward. Today, you will be presented with highly compressed statements that cover the topics: why things go bad, the American bias for war, the Middle East, the horrors of war, what's at the end of those missiles when they land, waging peace for a change, mass media, mass deception, the corruption of U.S. foreign policy, constructive engagement for peace, what a new government should be like in Washington. I hope that you will pursue these and other topics and stay in touch with these presenters, sowing the seeds for peace and teaching peace studies in our high school and our colleges, raising the question, is peace possible? By Michael McPherson, Executive Director of the Veterans for Peace, and by Barry Ladendorf, the President of Veterans for Peace, who will be the MCs today. And before I introduce them, I'd like to say something about the Veterans for Peace. It's a magnificent organization with chapters all over the country and several foreign countries. They hit the streets. They engage in nonviolent civil disobedience. These are veterans whose lives often have been destroyed by these criminal wars, by the manipulation of their patriotism, by war criminals and ideologues and draft dodgers who want others to go fight these criminal wars, like Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz and Elliot Abrams and others. These are veterans who have decided they have a mission in life, and that's to prevent a repetition of what they went through. These are veterans who are hurting. Some of them are here today. They are hurting every day, but they're rising above their hurt to lead the way into momentums for informed conscience and dedication in the pursuit of peace. I'm proud to be a member of the Veterans for Peace. Anybody who has not been in the military can still become associate members of the Veterans for Peace. Based in St. Louis, Missouri, the website is veteransforpeace.org. They will tell you what their agenda is, how broad, how deep, how exciting, how conscientious, how fact-based, how courageous, by comparison with the manipulation of the veterans who belong to the American Legion and veterans of foreign wars. They are truly a light unto our nation. And the members of the VFW and the American Legion must realize the extent of their manipulation by the forces of war and the institutions of military aggression, who realize that they must control those organizations and vector them toward constant aggressive portrayals of their annual meetings in order to undermine the expansion of conscientious veterans who can basically look at those who would manipulate them from their safe sanctuaries in this country and say what General George Patton once said, "Nuts to you. We're not going to have that flag manipulate us. That flag stands. That flag does not stand as a bandana. It does not stand as a gag in the mouth of the American people. It does not stand as a fig leaf covering the shame of war criminals wasting trillions of dollars of our tax money that can be brought back to rebuild our country, community by community. That flag stands for the last words of the Pledge of Allegiance, which, as we all remember, are for liberty and justice for all. That's what that flag stands for. Now I'd like to introduce Barry Ladendorf, who will join with Michael McPherson in emceeing today, and they will also have their own presentation. Barry Ladendorf is the president of Veterans for Peace. He's a lawyer. He's been in the U.S. Navy at high levels. He was a staff officer, commander, training command of the Pacific Fleet. He was in foreign training officer. He spent a lot of his years in the Attorney General's office in California, and spent a number of years in charge of health quality enforcement. He's received the Attorney General's Award for Excellence. He's taught law at the University of San Diego School of Law. He has founded a lot of local and invigorated a lot of local peace efforts in Southern California and elsewhere. And he's been all over the world. He's been in Okinawa. He's been in Ireland. He's been in hot spots. He's been in Hiroshima. He's been all over the world, and he has much to say. Michael McPherson's Executive Director of Veterans for Peace. You name a cause for civil rights, whether it's Ferguson, or whether it's discrimination against minorities. You name a cause for peace. You name a location for the expression of peace on the ground, and Michael McPherson has been there. He's been in the military. He's been in the first Gulf War. He's been in the artillery. He's seen what's happened. And he retired as a captain in the U.S. Army. He's now directing the Veterans for Peace Central Headquarters in St. Louis. And he has often been the first responder. For example, when Cindy Sheehan opened her little encampment next to George Bush's ranch, he was one of the first people down there. He's always one of the first people on the spot. So I'd like to introduce to you two great Americans who will introduce other great Americans, Michael McPherson and Barry Ladendorf.
All right, thank you for being here. This is an exciting event, and I'm proud to be here. I'm proud to stand on the stage, and I have to tell you, The people that are gathered here today is an amazing group of people, and obviously we're going to have the chance to go through each one of them. But there's one person in particular I wanted to say something real quick about, because I think it says a lot about this gathering, and that's Thomas Drake, who our government has said is a self-radicalized person. And I like that. I like that because everybody in this room is radicalized. And maybe you're radicalized, that's right. You're radicalized because you believe in the Constitution. You're radicalized because you believe in freedom, because you believe in peace, because you believe in human dignity. And we're not going to stand for what's happening. So yeah, we're radicalized, and we will change what is happening in this country.
Let's get the program underway. It's a real privilege and honor for me to introduce to you our first speaker for the day, Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. I think he's probably somebody that you're all familiar with. And I have to tell you that when I first heard of Colonel Wilkerson, I was flipping through my TV channels one day looking for some comment. I think it was what could have been CNN, it could have been MSNBC, I don't know which one it was. But they introduced the next speaker, or the commentator, was going to be Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, who was the chief of staff, I believe, working for Colin Powell at the time, or on the staff of Colin Powell. And I thought to myself, oh, well, here we go again. Somebody's going to be an apologist for the unnecessary, illegal, unjustified wars. But I was pleasantly and thrilled and surprised when Colin Powell, when Lawrence Wilkerson, he began to talk about the mismanagement of our wars in the Middle East, and that the United States was headed down the tubes if we continued along this disastrous path of reckless wars. And what I found out that day is that here's a man who will tell us the unvarnished truth about what's going on. He was direct, honest, and it was such a refreshing thing to hear someone, a former military, really tell the people the truth, and we all need to hear that. You're going to hear that from him today. You're going to hear that from other speakers today. So let me just give you a brief bio. You have the information in your pamphlet, but I want to highlight just a couple of things. So he spent 31 years in the Army, retired from that. And then there was a couple of questions that I had about his resume when I looked at it. I noticed that he was on the faculty of the Naval War College. And as Ralph said, I was just a junior officer in the Navy, and I wondered, what is an Army officer doing at the Naval War College? And then I remembered that somebody has to explain to the Navy what it is the Army does. And so, and then I saw that he was also the director of the Marine Corps War College, and I was wondering myself, having worked with Marines as part of the Navy, I wondered, how is it that the Marine Corps allowed an Army guy to be the director of the Marine Corps War College? But obviously, when you listen to him talk, and the skill and the knowledge and the information he has, it'd be pretty clear why anybody would want him to do that. So he was a special assistant to General Colin Powell in 1989 and 1983. And then, of course, he was the Secretary of State, Colin Powell's Chief of Staff from 2003 and to 2005. So, why things go bad? Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson.
It was in an editorial that I read yesterday. I don't even remember the author or the source, somewhere out in the hinterland, and amongst those groups of journalists who still work for this country in a real formidable way, constitute at least a small part of the Fourth Estate. After recounting Vietnam, Lebanon, which we often forget, where the Marines suffered in a single day their largest casualty count since Tarawa in World War II, Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, he wrote these words: all those American memories are lost to oblivion, and I might add, amongst the United States of amnesia, as Gore Vidal so aptly said. Such forgetfulness only allows our war makers to do yet more of the same things in Iraq and Syria and possibly Iran, acts that someone on the ground will be forced to remember forever if they're still alive, perhaps under the shadow of a drone overhead. Placing our service people in harm's way, spending our money in prodigious amounts, laying the country's credibility on the line once required at least the pretext that some national interest was at stake. Not anymore. Anytime some group we don't like threatens a group we care not so much about either, the United States must act to save a proud people, stop a humanitarian crisis, take down a brutal leader, put an end to genocide, whatever will briefly engage the public and spin up some vague facsimile of war fever and fear. What a powerful statement. And I could add to that, in fact, I think he left out, whenever Lockheed Martin feels it needs an extra billion or to keep a production line warm, or the corporate media, the mainstream media, needs its ratings to go up. Where did we come from and how did we get here? I want to give you a brief synopsis of that from not just my military professional perspective, but also an academic's perspective, having studied it for 6 years in the nation's war colleges and now 11 years on 2 campuses amongst some really great students. First of all, we've got Harry Truman. Despite what David McCullough writes about him so eloquently in the big book about him by that name, Truman, Harry sets the precedent in 1950 when North Korea invades South Korea. He violates the U.S. Constitution and introduces U.S. military forces into the conflict without even saying a word to the constitutional power, in this case, the Congress. Dean Acheson, his powerful Secretary of State, tells him, you can't do this. You come from that body. The Constitution says they have the war power. You have to go there. Truman does not. Precedent number 1. Second precedent by Truman too. Here's a man who goes before a joint session of Congress and says we need universal health care. Yes, go check the speech. We need houses for the poor, etc., etc. He so shocks his own Democratic Party that you think if you're in the leadership of that party, let alone being a Republican leader, that you've got FDR times 10. But less than a year later, Harry Truman will preside over the greatest increase in defense spending in the history of this nation. The figures won't shock you because they're small in terms of 1945, 46, 47. We go from about 13 billion to 55 billion overnight. An incredible increase, and it's all to build the armaments industry necessary for the Cold War. We've never had this industry before. All of a sudden, it's essential to our existence. Second, what does that do? Well, we all know what Dwight Eisenhower said about the military-industrial complex in his farewell address, but we forget that address he gave in '53 to the Association of Newspaper Editors, where he said eloquently, this is no way of life at all in any true sense. It is humanity hanging from a cross of iron. This is a 5-star general, iconic hero from World War II, saying if we continue to do this, we'll all be hanging from a cross of iron. Today, it isn't the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower envisioned so presciently. It's the military-industrial, congressional, university, private security contractor, and on ad nauseum complex. They all are warmongers. And the third, or the fourth precedent, depending on how many you're counting, we come to 1973 and the War Powers Act. Richard Nixon was so stupid he vetoed it. The Congress passed it over his veto because the Congress was absolutely adamant it was going to abandon formally and statutorily its war power in the Constitution. And that's exactly what it did. In the War Powers Act, it essentially said to the president, we know you're going to do this. We know you're going to go to war. That's okay, do it. Just report to us periodically. And oh, by the way, if you do it for too long and we don't like it, we'll cut off your money. What an abdication of authority. Madison wrote eloquently, the clearest route to tyranny is the war power. The clearest route to tyranny is the war power. So here we have the Congress abandoning that constitutional power to the President of the United States. Next step, almost simultaneously, Nixon is so sick of the draft because it caused him, in part at least, to have to leave Vietnam, he gets rid of the draft, gets rid of conscription. So we get the all-volunteer force. Do the numbers. Since we created the all-volunteer force, we have gone to war, used military force 5.8 times more frequently than we did in the 150 years prior, much of that time with a professional force, but a professional force that was occupied mainly with the Indian Wars out on the western frontier. But if you look at it closely since the end of the Cold War, you will see that we have doubled the amount of times that the president has used the war instrument. Doubled it. And yet we've come out of the shadow of that existential conflict with 30,000 missiles and other warheads pointed at us every day. And we're in a world where that doesn't even exist anymore, and one would have to argue that there is any existential threat to this republic other than us ourselves. So you take this force, this all-volunteer force, and you go have a panel out at the University of Kentucky, as we did, a number of us, academics, former soldiers, Marines, sailors, airmen, and so forth, last month, and you begin to examine what it's doing to the country. Not only do you find that you have a propensity for war of about 2.5 to 1 with this non-conscripted force, because let's face it, less than 1% of the nation, 330 million people, is bleeding and dying for the other 99+%. That's really fine. That's great. Anybody can be for war when they have absolutely no dog in the fight, absolutely no blood in the conflict. We also found out that it's bankrupting us. You haven't checked this lately because DOD lies about it every day. You have to really ferret around in the archives to find the information. The all-volunteer force, on a current linear projection of costs, will essentially use the entire Army and Marine Corps budget in 2030 to pay for its people, period. No guns, no bullets, no gas, no nothing. Now, some of us would say, hey, good. But if you think, as I do, that from time to time, there might be an existential or at least a serious threat to this country, and we do need an armed force, you're concerned about it, very concerned about it. When you look at what the Air Force is doing with the B-21, the new nuclear strike cruise missile, which is needed like a hole in the head is needed, you look at the money we're going to spend on nuclear weapons after President Obama said we were going to do away with nuclear weapons, and you wonder, where is the sanity? Where is the reason? Now I come to the last facet of this discussion about why you're going to see war interminably. Indeed, you are seeing it interminably. When will we ever be not at war? 15 years straight now, and no end in sight. $4 trillion. Yes, that's with a T. We are printing the money. The rest of the world is beginning to become so concerned about us that, for example, in Tokyo, you have Prime Minister Abe unencumbering the Japanese military. Why is he doing that? Not so much because he wants to stand Japan up as a normal nation with everything from a military-industrial complex to possibly even nuclear weapons. It's because he doesn't trust us anymore. And I find that in Berlin, I find it in Paris, I find it all across the globe. But this last element is the one my students find most perplexing. We do this in my seminars. We study presidential decision-making. We call them fateful decisions because they're those decisions that send young men and young women to die for state purposes. And something we often forget, to kill others for state purposes. 2.5 million, for example, in Vietnam. By conservative estimates, 300,000 in Iraq, and still counting. This last element is perplexing. I call it the presidential predilection for power. What do I mean by that? I mean simply that our president is so encumbered otherwise. We think he's powerful. He's not. I've been there. I've seen 3 of them, up close and personal. They can hardly get anything done except war. When you put a president in the Oval Office and encumber him with the bureaucracy that exists to this day, when you make him subservient to the director of national intelligence, the director of the CIA, subservient to all the forces that are going to impinge on him immediately that are advocating for war, then he has one way of demonstrating he's king of the hill. One way of showing his bona fides or her bona fides, and that worries me greatly, and that is war. You've got to find a war. You've got to find something where you can demonstrate that you are indeed the most powerful leader in the world. War has become the predilection of presidents. When you put all these factors together, institutional, personal, character-wise, sociology of the decision-making team, and so forth, President Obama has called it the playbook. The playbook, he's right. War is the end product of the playbook of decision-making in the United States of America. And I will stand here, and I'm 71 years old. I might have a decade left, and tell you that in my lifetime, probably in my children's lifetime, if we don't do something about it, we're going to stay at war. Halliburton made $44 billion off Iraq and Afghanistan. Lockheed Martin ran in a really distant second with about $13.6 billion. You know, I could go down the list: Boeing, Grumman, Raytheon. I'd love to see what Raytheon is making right now off all the bombs and cruise missiles it makes that are being expended in Syria. I'm sure they won't tell me what the bottom line is, but someone like Bill Hartung or someone like him will let us know soon, probably. It's incredible. A lieutenant colonel in the Marine Corps once said to me, when you put that much money, when you put that much capital against the war instrument, you are going to have more of it. It's that simple. And it's also simple in terms of a solution. But I've been in every state in this union over the past 5 years. I've talked to audiences on 100 different collegiate campuses in communities and townships from New Hampshire to Southern California. And I find the solution barren. The solution is you. The solution is the American people. The solution is Americans who grow so angry and so fatigued with this constant warfare that they do something about it. And I say the first step should be to throw every single bastard in the United States Congress out. There's some good people there, no question about it. Tim Kaine from Virginia, his son's a Marine. I might make one or two exceptions, but if I had to make a decision on whether it was all of them or none of them, I would not hesitate to say all of them. Get rid of them. Try another bunch, and if they don't work, throw them out too. Why don't we do what needs to be done? I find all across the country an apathy so deep and profound that it stuns me. And this is in the military too. One of the things we discussed at the University of Kansas was the alienation of the military. The military is growing further and further, as you would imagine it would, from the American people. Further and further. You have no idea what the military thinks about the rest of the country right now. What it thinks about its government. And this circus going on right now called a political campaign or campaigns is doing nothing but exacerbating it. We are a joke. The rest of the world sees the circus and shudders because we still have a lot of power left, and the old metaphor about even a dying elephant can crush a lot of grass is very apt. So I'll leave you with that message, and I'm sure others will leave you with a similar message. until we, the American people, do something about this penchant for war, you are going to have more of it, and you're going to have less and less of your taxpayer money to spend on the country and on our real needs, and you're going to have the empire falling apart around its own institutions and its own people, because history tells us the world, once it grows significantly tired of us, will move to balance us. I'm not sure it's not already doing so. Thank you.
Next speaker that I'm going to be proud to introduce, Paul Pillar. In 2005, Paul retired from a distinguished 28-year career in the U.S. intelligence community, where he served as the National Intelligence Officer for Near East and South Asia. He was also an executive assistant to William Webster when he was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. He also headed the Assessments and Information Group of DCI Counterterrorism Center, and from 1997 to 99 was the deputy chief of the center. Currently, he is a researcher at the Center for Security Studies at Georgetown University. I draw your attention, if you want a really good, a great new book, is Mr. Pillar's new book, Why America Misunderstands the World: National Experience and the Roots of Misperception. Has won a lot of high praise. One reviewer said, "This book confirms Pillar's status as one of the smartest and sanest writers on U.S. foreign policy."
Since World War II, the use of U.S. military force overseas has exhibited two patterns that, if you put them together, are simply unjustifiable. One is the increasing frequency and duration of applications of military force, such that we've had a whole generation of Americans who have grown up with their nation permanently at war. The other pattern is that the overall results of this fighting overseas have been, in contrast to the great victory in World War II, poor. The next major effort was Korea. That was more or less a tie. And then the only other major war that you could say was a win was Operation Desert Storm, which was the expulsion of the Iraqi troops from Kuwait. Everything else was on the other side of the ledger as far as major military force was concerned. That includes the fiascos in Vietnam and Iraq, a war in Afghanistan that has gone on for 14 years since the U.S. got directly involved in it, and with only mixed results when we get down to the lesser air and ground operations. The United States clearly has been using military force more than what prudent pursuit of its interests would dictate. And yet it keeps coming back for more. An impulse to do more rather than fewer foreign military expeditions, despite that poor record, is reflected not only in the trend toward permanent warfare over the past couple of decades, but also in current pressure in American debates that you hear in Washington here every day about applying still more military force in the Middle East. The impulse to do more militarily is not just a matter of particular policymakers misunderstanding particular conflicts. It goes deeper than that. My friend Larry Wilkerson has discussed some of the reasons for that, and I'm going to discuss a few more. Explanations that focus on supposedly new global threats, especially terrorism, really don't explain much, except for, obviously, the major militancy in American public mood that occurred after one big terrorist attack 15 years ago. But international terrorism has been around for centuries. It's been touching U.S. interests for decades. Moreover, much of the recent application of U.S. military force really doesn't have anything to do with countering terrorism. That includes the costly expedition into Iraq, which had nothing to do with it despite contorted efforts by the promoters of that war to capitalize on that militant post-9/11 public mood. For much of our nation's history, war was infrequent, thanks in large part to the physical separations of those two great ocean moats, the Atlantic and the Pacific, that have separated us from most of what otherwise might have been threats to us. Americans thought about war as something to which they needed to resort only infrequently, sallying forth to eliminate whatever was the threat that was sufficiently serious to justify such an expedition. But then, after World War II, the United States became intensely engaged all over the world. in a way that Americans were used to associating with being at war, even if some wars would be called cold rather than hot. Thus, it's an irony of American history that the infrequency of wars throughout the 19th century helped to shape a national outlook that, combined with America's global involvement in the 21st century, has brought Americans close to believing themselves to be in perpetual war. And that belief has helped to foster the reality. The over-optimism that Americans of post-World War II generations have repeatedly exhibited as to what can be accomplished with new applications of U.S. military force is rooted partly in the remarkable success that the United States has achieved in so many endeavors throughout its history, including, with regard to military force, what was a wonderful winning streak up until World War II. American successes have been so obvious, so long-standing, and so deeply embedded in American culture and lore that they still shape current discourse on the use of military force. What should have been sobering lessons from the more recent and less successful military interventions tend to get swept aside in favor of the historically based optimism about the use of force. We hear frequently the admonition not to overreact to that bad experience in the Iraq War. We hear it so often that it's an overreaction about overreaction. Coupled with that theme are efforts to depict any proposals for more military intervention in the Middle East as shorter, quicker, and easier than the quagmire that the Iraq War became. The relevance of lessons from Iraq simply gets defined away with unrealistically rosy images of what the next war is going to look like. Now, there are certain other rhetorical dynamics, I would call them, of current debates about the use of force in Syria and Iraq that add to the historically based bias in favor of resorting to the military instrument. One is the American habit of discussing almost any serious problem overseas as a problem that the United States can and should solve. A related rhetorical asymmetry is the greater appeal of positive-sounding calls for the United States to do just that, compared with the lesser appeal of anyone who exhibits or voices caution or skepticism about whether the United States really can solve other people's civil wars or comparable problems. To say anything that sounds like, that's a nasty problem, but given the downsides of our available options, we're just going to have to live with it, is not the sort of thing that wins American politicians' votes. The public and political appetite for action usually means specifically visible, forceful action. And that generally means, in most minds, military responses. They have greater appeal than less visible policy tools, like behind-the-scenes diplomacy. Amid today's issues centered on the Middle East, the so-called war on terror concept, a concept and a term that has long outlived the administration that first put it into use, continues to weigh heavily on American debate and discourse on foreign policy. It is a metaphor that has shaped literal reality. It leads to the false syllogism that if a problem is serious, then we are at war. And if we are at war, then we have to use military force to solve it. A related pseudo-logic equates leadership with toughness and toughness with the use of military force. Then there is the luxury that political opponents have, and incumbent policymakers do not, of sounding appealing themes, such as the ones I just mentioned, about solving every problem out there, without having to voice the less appealing cautions about long-term complications and consequences, such as what we've suffered in Iraq. Amid fears of terrorist groups and a presidential election campaign, the rhetorical energy is predominantly in the direction of pushing for more rather than less use of military force. Another factor is the universal human tendency to treat sunk costs as investments. This tendency has especially affected American discourse about Iraq, and all the more so given propagation of the myth, and it is a myth, that the United States was on the verge of achieving a victory there as of about 2009. Actually, a civil war was still going at quite a rapid clip. But sunk costs really are sunk, and past ill-advised expenditures have not bought any new current opportunities. Then at some level of consciousness, there's the pottery barn rule, invoked by my friend Larry Wilkerson's former boss. If you break it, you buy it. And that's affected American thinking about some troublesome military operations. By itself, the rule is laudable. It teaches responsibility. The trouble is, people don't tend to invoke the rule until breakage has already occurred. And with Americans thinking of themselves as builders rather than breakers, some commitments have been made with insufficient advance thought about what really was likely to be broken. Now, all of these factors that I mentioned and ones that you heard earlier from Larry have contributed to putting the United States in its current state of unending warfare and continuing the costly pattern of using military force beyond what careful considerations of U.S. interest would dictate. The most intense debates right now about the use of armed force are now centered on the group that's called ISIS and its enclaves in Iraq and especially Syria, where the ISIS problem is superimposed on a complicated civil war. Given that ISIS has come to occupy in American minds the place that Al-Qaeda previously did, as this feared international terrorist group, discussion of what to do about it is heavily weighted down by the baggage of 9/11 and that so-called war on terror. Among the consequences is the presumption that military force is the primary, and sometimes in some minds the only, tool to wage this war, and an assumption that if ISIS is not dispatched in the Middle East, then it's likely to cause awful things to happen here in the United States. Now, more sober consideration of the threats and options would begin by recalling that what should be one of the leading lessons of the Iraq War, that ISIS did not exist before that war, and that the group, which was originally known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq, came into existence as a direct result of the civil war in Iraq that the U.S. invasion and overthrow of Saddam Hussein directly ignited. One of the two countries where ISIS has established its enclave, Iraq involves for Americans the baggage of the Iraq War and the associated attitudes about sunk costs. But Syria is the even more complicated place because of the uprising against the Assad regime. The revolt has gotten regime change juices flowing again in the United States, as it did before with Iraq, and as it stimulated an American itch to weigh in militarily more recently in Libya, where, by the way, as you see, the consequence is chaos and a lot of destruction and more extremism, and ISIS has established a beachhead there. In Syria, this is so even though the Assad family has ruled in Damascus for nearly half a century. So there would not seem to be any reason for urgency to get rid of that particular regime. Much of the urging to do more militarily in Syria constitutes, to be quite frank, inchoate expressions of toughness by American politicians or of displeasure with the Syrian mess expressed by many others who assume that this is one more of those problems overseas that the United States, if it just puts enough power and enough smarts to it, ought to be able to solve. Proposals for U.S. ground operations against ISIS are based on the false premise that taking out, that's the term you often hear, taking out the group with a quick assault on its positions would be the end of the task. It would not. It instead would mark the beginning of a new phase of the war characterized by guerrilla attacks, terrorism, and other, what the military calls, asymmetric operations. Chaos and instability left where the self-styled caliphate of ISIS once stood would be a fertile garden for additional terrorism and extremism, whether it bore the ISIS name or some other label. There would be no more justification for declaring a mission to be accomplished after toppling the ISIS command structure than there was for declaring mission accomplished in Iraq after toppling Saddam Hussein's regime. For the United States to plunge into the Syrian war would play right into ISIS's hands. It would confirm the group's narratives about it supposedly leading a Muslim defense against a predatory West, and about apocalypse between itself and the leader of the West, the United States. The inevitable collateral damage from increased lethal operations would also foster exactly the sort of resentment that aids recruitment for groups such as ISIS. Now, President Obama, when pressed to do more militarily, has explained the situations in Syria and Iraq in terms that indicate that he understands at some level the aforementioned costs and risks of the sort that I've described, and some of the ones that Larry's described as well. His successor, however, is likely to be someone who not only will have more hawkish views, but also, especially as a first-term president, will be more easily moved by the urges and impulses that have pushed the United States into this state of perpetual warfare. Those urges and impulses are deeply rooted in America's history and circumstances, and thus in American habits of thinking. Occasionally, as after the Vietnam War, with over 50,000 American deaths, when we had something that got referred to as the Vietnam War syndrome, the sheer magnitude of the cost has led to a temporary break from those habits. But then we had Operation Desert Storm a few years later, and everyone thought, hey, that's nice, we win wars again. The nature of current debate suggests that no such new break is imminent. The United States appears destined, for reasons related to what it makes it exceptional, to continue using military force beyond what serves its interests. It will take exceptional leadership to limit the resulting damage. It also will take greater insistence by all of the rest of us on opening up the deliberative process that leads to decisions to employ armed force abroad, to make sure there is a deliberative process, and to bring to bear all relevant considerations on such decisions. Now, anything that mobilizes and provides a larger megaphone for the relevant expertise certainly can help, but I would especially emphasize the role of Congress. And you heard some pretty blunt words from Larry about the extent to which the Congress has done its duty. Insistence on the legislative branch functioning as a co-equal policy-making arm of government on matters of war and peace, which it has failed to do in recent decades, is vital for several reasons, including, and I'm speaking as a retired bureaucrat, I've had the experience in this, including having a separate and legitimate channel besides whatever is the incumbent administration for applying the judgments and expertise of the relevant components within the government. The run-up to the Iraq War, in which there was no policy process whatever for assessing whether launching that war was a good idea, in which there was no clear decision point for separating legitimate input from the bureaucracy about the consequences of the invasion from what would have been insubordination once a decision has been made. And only a very cursory and lackadaisical exercise by the Congress of its duties provides a glaring example of how not to do it. With a process such as that, we should not be surprised when the result is a costly disaster. The United States needs to do far better than that. Thank you very much.
And now I bring to you Stephen Kinzer.
Well, it's great to be here in Washington in this wonderful hall, but I must say I come to Washington as little as possible. Every time I do, I am struck by how narrow is the spectrum of acceptable opinions on foreign policy in this city and in this country. If you do not accept dozens and dozens of premises about America and America's role in the world, you're excluded from the foreign policy conversation. You have to believe in the exceptional nature of the United States. You have to believe that America is the enforcer of the world system. When I start out my course at Brown on the history of American intervention, I give a few rules to the kids in the class in the first minutes, like don't use your cell phone and so forth. And I tell them, I don't want you eating in class either. Then I take out a big sandwich and I start munching on it with my mouth full. I say, "Oh, Indian class, that's so awful. It's disrespectful, it's disruptive." I'm swallowing my food. And I say, "You see, I'm like the United States. I make the rules, but I don't have to follow them." You have to accept that this is a legitimate role for the United States in order to participate in the foreign policy discussion. You also have to believe that coercive power is the real way the world runs. You have to believe that the world is comprised of good and evil, and that force is often necessary because force is the only language that evil understands. Now, in many other cultures, people don't grow up believing in the good-evil dichotomy. They grow up believing that there's good and evil in all of us, and these come out in different proportions according to different situations. If you believe that, you're not entitled to participate in foreign policy making in the United States. You have to believe that a providential mission has been given to the United States, and we would be sinful if we did not go out and try to share with everyone in the world the goodness of our society. And the fact that there are people out there who don't want our influence just shows how backward they are and makes us think even more firmly that we have to go in and tell them what to do. So shaping parts of the world, like shaping the Middle East, is a big part of the American concept. And it never seems to occur to us that actually many people around the world have cultures of their own that are very old and predate the United States, and they have other ways of living that are different from ours. And just as their systems and lives would not be valid for us, ours are not valid for them. There is no universally applicable rule of what a good society is like. When George Bush said, "If the truths of our founding fathers are true for us, they're true for all people," he was wrong. They were right for us. They were not right for all people. Now, one effect of this Washington echo chamber plays out in the way foreign policy and world events are covered in the American press, particularly with the shrinking size of American foreign correspondence. An increasing amount of news that we read about the world actually doesn't come from the world. It comes from Washington, D.C. So, our news about the Syrian war is largely, for example, coming from Washington. Who produces the news about the world that we read that comes out of Washington? Well, journalists, of course, are based in Washington. They're in this echo chamber. When an event happens, they need to check out what happened. Or when an American project is being planned overseas, they have to try to understand it. So what do? They call a wide variety of sources. They not only call the White House, they also call the Pentagon. Then they call the State Department. And then they call a few of those think tanks that we heard about earlier. By then, they've covered the whole landscape and they can write their story. This is why you have such narrow-minded and ignorant reporting about places like Syria coming out all over the United States.